The last thing Diane said to me before I flew to Minnesota was that she'd take good care of the house. She said it standing in my kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee like she owned the place. Cooper was sitting at the table eating cereal, and she put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Leonard. We've got everything covered." I believed her. That was my mistake. My name is Leonard Whitfield. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a construction engineer, built things that are still standing all over this state, raised 2 kids in a house on Crestview Drive in Phoenix, and buried my wife Patricia in 2021 after 34 years of marriage. 3 years later, I checked into Mayo Clinic in Rochester with a heart that needed serious attention. Blocked arteries, the cardiologist said, not optional. 6 weeks of treatment, monitoring, and recovery. I left the house key with my son Nate. I left Nate in the care of his wife Diane. I flew to Minnesota thinking the hardest part of the next 6 weeks would be the hospital food. I was wrong about that. I came home on a Thursday afternoon in March. Taxi from the airport, same route. I'd driven 1,000 times. My discharge papers were folded in my coat pocket. My heart was functioning better than it had in years, and I was thinking about Cooper. He'd started 2nd grade while I was gone. I'd missed his first baseball game of the season. I was planning to take him to the garage that weekend and let him help me finish the workbench project we'd started in January. The taxi pulled up to 221-4 Crestview Drive, and I got out with my bag and walked up to my front door. The key didn't work. I stood there for a moment just turning it, thinking maybe I had the wrong key, but I've used that same key for 14 years. The electronic keypad beside the door showed a screen I'd never seen before. I tried my garage remote, nothing, not even a click. A woman answered the door. She was in her mid-40s, hair pulled back, holding a dish towel. She looked at me with the careful expression people use when a stranger shows up on their porch. I told her my name. I told her I owned the house. She called for her husband, and he came to the door and said they'd bought the place 3 weeks ago. Closed, escrow, moved in, repainted the hallway. Everything signed and filed with the county. I sat down on the porch step and called Nate. He answered on the 2nd ring. I told him what was happening, and I heard his voice go quiet in a way I didn't like. Then he said, "Dad, Diane handled all the paperwork while you were gone. I signed something, but she told me it was a property maintenance authorization. So you could stay on the utility accounts and she could deal with the HOA while you were at the clinic." I asked him if he'd read what he signed. Another pause. She said it was standard. She walked me through it and told me what each page was. I asked him what Diane had told him about the sale. She said you'd talked about it before you left, that you'd decided the house was too much to manage alone and that the money was going into an account for your care. She said you didn't want to worry me with the details. I had never said any of those things to anyone. The couple who'd bought the house, Lester and Nadine Calloway, were decent people. They could see something was badly wrong and they gave me space on the porch while I made calls. A retired pharmacist and a former school teacher who'd saved for 20 years to buy a retirement home. They had nothing to do with what had been done to me, and standing there, I was already separating them from the people who did. The police came within 20 minutes. 2 officers who were professional and thorough. They looked at the deed, looked at the sale documents, looked at the power of attorney that had my signature on it. On paper, everything was clean. Sale completed legally, new deed filed, notarized properly by a woman named Shirley Bowman. The officer told me if I believed there was fraud, I'd need to pursue it through civil channels. He wasn't dismissing me, he was just telling me the truth. I looked at that power of attorney for a long time in the back of my rental car later that evening. I'd been in construction for 31 years. I'd read more contracts than most lawyers. I knew my own signature, knew the specific way I formed the loop on the capital L in Leonard, the slight rightward lean on the W. Whoever had signed that document had gotten close, but the R in Leonard was wrong. Too open at the top. I'd been closing that loop since I was in high school. I called my daughter Beverly in Denver. She listened without saying a word until I finished. "Did anyone contact you about the house?" I asked. "Not once," she said. "Not a single word. I need a notarized statement from you by tomorrow saying you never signed or authorized anything related to a sale." "I'll have it to you tonight," she said. Then I called Philip Lawson, 22 years as my attorney. Real estate, the family trust, everything. He picked up on the 3rd ring and I told him the whole thing. "Don't contact Diane," he said. "Don't contact Earl. Don't tell them anything. Give me 48 hours. I checked into a hotel and sat on the bed with my laptop open, pulling every document I had out of cloud storage. The Mitchell family trust documents were exactly where I'd saved them. The original deed showing my name as sole owner since 2009. The limited power of attorney from my gallbladder surgery 4 years ago, which had a clear expiration clause. It had been dead for 3 years before I ever stepped on that plane to Minnesota. Diane had used a document that no longer existed. The POA attached to the sale was different from mine. Same header, same basic structure, but broader language covering real property transactions. Someone had drafted a new one and put my signature on it. I stared at that signature for a long time. The loop on the L was almost right. The W had the correct lean. But the R in Leonard was open at the top and mine never is. I've been closing that loop the same way since I learned cursive in 4th grade. I sent Philip a scanned copy at 11 that night and went to sleep with the laptop still open. The next morning, Floyd Mercer called me. Philip had already reached out to him. Floyd was a private investigator I'd used twice during my engineering career when subcontractors tried to bury liability in paperwork. He was quiet, methodical, and he didn't waste words. He said he'd have preliminary findings within 72 hours and hung up. 48 hours after that, he called back. Sun State Property Holdings LLC, he said. Registered in Arizona in 2019. Registered agent is Earl Greer. Home office address matches his residence in Scottsdale. Earl Greer was Diane's father. He'd held an Arizona real estate broker's license for 19 years. On the surface, he was just a concerned father-in-law helping navigate a complicated family situation while his daughter's father-in-law was in the hospital. That's how he'd presented himself to the escrow company, the title agent, and anyone else who had asked a question. What he had not told any of them was that he was the buyer. He had purchased my house through a shell company he controlled for $285,000. The assessed market value at the time of sale was $415,000. 3 months later, after minor cosmetic updates, he had relisted the property and sold it to the Callaways for $430,000. His profit on the transaction, not counting costs, was $145,000 and none of it declared to the IRS. I sat with that information for a full day before I said anything to anyone except Philip. It wasn't impulse or desperation. It wasn't Diane panicking because Nate had gambled them into a hole. This was a planned transaction. Earl had the LLC ready. He'd waited for the right window, and my 6 weeks in Rochester had given it to him. The POA was drafted specifically for property transactions. Shirley Bowman, the notary, had authenticated a document she should never have touched. Philip filed for a forensic document examination on day 5. Audrey Vance came in on day 6. She was in her late 40s, efficient, and she handled the POA the way a surgeon handles an instrument. She spread it on the table, used a magnifying apparatus, then brought out a device I didn't recognize. "The ink on this document is less than 5 weeks old," she said. The paper stock matches a commercial printer supply brand discontinued in 2022, which means this was printed on stockpiled inventory. And the person who signed your name was right-handed, but writing with compensated pressure, like someone naturally left-handed forcing the right hand. I told her Diane had been left-handed since childhood. Audrey wrote a 14-page report. She included ink composition analysis, pressure mapping, and a direct comparison with 6 authenticated signatures of mine pulled from notarized documents Philip had on file. The conclusion was unambiguous. The signature was not mine. What happened next with Nate was harder than any of the legal work. He came to the hotel on day 7. I hadn't called him with details yet, only told him I needed to show him some documents in person. He sat across from me at the small desk in my room and I laid everything out. The original POA he'd signed, the one that had actually been filed, the differences between them, Audrey's report, Floyd's findings on Earl and the LLC. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said she walked me through every page. She sat right next to me and explained what each section meant. I told him I knew. "I thought I was helping you," he said. "She told me you were stressed about the house and that this would take the burden off while you were recovering. The thing about Nate is that he's not a careless person. He reads things, he asks questions." Diane had known that, which is why she'd sat beside him and explained each page out loud while he signed. She'd told him what it said. The words on the page said something different. He looked at me and asked what we were going to do. I told him I needed one thing from him first, a notarized statement that he had not knowingly authorized the sale of my property, had not understood the document to be a real estate power of attorney, and had been given a false description of what he was signing. He said he'd have it the next morning. Then I told him the second thing I needed him to be patient, stay calm around Diane, and not change anything in his behavior at home. Not yet. I needed a few more weeks before any of this moved into the open. He looked at me for a long moment. "You already have a plan," he said. I told him I was working on one. The hardest part of those weeks wasn't the legal work. It wasn't sleeping in a hotel room or eating takeout every night or spending hours on the phone with Philip going over documents. The hardest part was Cooper. My grandson was 7 years old. Every Saturday morning since he could walk, he'd come over to the garage workshop with me. I'd taught him how to hold a tape measure, how to read a level, how to identify wood by grain and smell. After Patricia died, those Saturday mornings became the thing I built my week around. Cooper didn't know that. He was just a kid who liked tools and sawdust and the way wood smelled when you cut it fresh, but I knew. 3 days after I got back from Rochester, I called Nate to ask about bringing Cooper over to the hotel for a few hours, just to see him. Nate went quiet for a moment and then said Diane had told him that the stress of Grandpa's situation wasn't good for Cooper right now, that it was better to give things time to settle before mixing the kids into it. Cooper was the only grandchild I had. He wasn't being mixed into anything. He was being used as a door that could be opened or closed depending on what Diane needed from me. I told Nate I understood and got off the phone. Then I sat in that hotel room for about 20 minutes doing nothing. After that, I called Philip and told him to move faster. Floyd had already identified the buyer contact we needed. His name was Gary Pruitt, a commercial real estate acquisition consultant who had done legitimate work for years and occasionally assisted in investigations when the situation called for it. He was credible, he was clean, and he had no visible connection to me or to Philip. Gary reached out to Earl Greer through a referral from a mutual contact in the Phoenix development community. Cold approach, nothing unusual. He said he was looking at properties in the Paradise Valley corridor for a client interested in quick turnaround residential investments. Earl called him back within 4 hours. They met for coffee on a Tuesday. Floyd sat 2 tables away reading a newspaper. Earl was comfortable from the first meeting. He liked talking. He liked being the one in the room who knew how things worked. Over coffee, he explained the general shape of how he found opportunities. Distress situations, he called them, families dealing with medical expenses, estates being settled, older owners who needed liquidity fast. He said the key was moving before the seller had time to get independent advice. Gary asked how he structured the acquisitions to keep things clean on the title side. Earl explained the LLC approach in detail. How you kept the purchasing entity separate from your licensed brokerage to avoid conflict of interest flags. How you used a cooperative notary to smooth the paperwork. How family situations created what he called motivated circumstances that made sellers easier to work with. He didn't use my name in that first meeting, but the numbers he described, the timing, the below-market acquisition through a family connection, it was my house. There was no other deal that matched. Gary met with Earl 2 more times over 10 days. By the 3rd meeting, Earl had relaxed enough to walk through the Crestview Drive transaction specifically. He described the POA, the speed of the close, the cosmetic updates he'd made before relisting, and the $145,000 margin he'd cleared when the Callaways bought it for $430,000. Every word across all 3 meetings was recorded on a device Gary wore in his jacket pocket. Floyd delivered the audio files to Philip on a Wednesday morning. I sat in Philip's conference room and listened to all of it. Earl's voice was calm and satisfied throughout. He sounded like a man describing a skill he'd perfected over years. Philip filed with the Arizona Department of Real Estate on Thursday morning. The complaint included the audio recordings, Floyd's LLC research, Audrey's forensic report, Beverly's notarized statement, Nate's notarized statement, and the documented comparison between the original medical POA and the fraudulent property POA. The IRS criminal referral for Earl's $145,000 unreported gain went out the same afternoon. The civil suit, fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy was filed Friday morning in Maricopa County Superior Court. By Friday at 3 in the afternoon, Earl Greer's real estate license was under emergency suspension pending investigation. I found out about the suspension from Philip while I was sitting on a bench at Papago Park. I'd asked Nate to bring Cooper to meet me there, away from the house, without telling Diane in advance. Nate had decided he was done asking her permission for things that were none of her business. Cooper ran across the grass and grabbed my arm with both hands. "Grandpa, where did you go? Dad said you were at the doctor." I told him I'd had some things to take care of, but that I was fine now. He accepted that the way 7-year-olds do, without needing more, and then asked if we could go to the garage on Saturday. I told him soon. Nate stood a few feet back, watching. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from holding something together that keeps wanting to fall apart. He'd been doing that for weeks, staying calm around Diane, not changing anything. Waiting, I walked over to him and told him it was almost time. He nodded. He'd been ready for a while. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in late April. Maricopa County Superior Court, Judge Carol Webb presiding. I'd looked her up before the date. 21 years on the bench, former civil litigator, known for keeping proceedings tight and tolerating nothing she considered a waste of the court's time. Philip said she was exactly who we wanted. Diane arrived with a lawyer named Sandra Holt, a woman with a sharp reputation for defending financial fraud cases in Phoenix. She'd gotten people out of worse than this on technicalities, Philip told me. But he didn't seem concerned. He said technicalities required gaps in the evidence, and we didn't have any gaps. Nate sat on my side of the courtroom. He'd moved out of the house the week before, taking Cooper with him to stay at Beverly's apartment while she was visiting from Denver. Diane had tried to block it. She'd called her own lawyer, made calls to Nate's phone every hour for 2 days. Nate had changed his number and finished packing. I watched him walk into that courtroom and sit down beside me, and I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Philip presented the evidence in sequence. He didn't rush and he didn't editorialize. He let the documents speak. First, the original medical POA from 4 years ago, with its clear expiration clause highlighted in yellow. Then the fraudulent property POA filed with the sale, with Audrey Vance's forensic analysis projected on the screen at the front of the courtroom. The ink composition, the pressure mapping, the signature comparison showing my authenticated R against the open-topped forgery. Audrey testified via secure video link, walking the judge through each finding with the patience of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly how much detail a court needed. Judge Webb leaned forward during Audrey's testimony and studied the projected signature comparison herself. She asked 2 technical questions. Audrey answered both without hesitation. Then Philip played the recordings. Earl's voice filled the courtroom. Calm, relaxed, walking Gary Pruitt through the LLC structure, the cooperative notary, the motivated circumstances. When he got to the part about the Crestview Drive transaction, specifically describing the $105,000 margin, Diane's lawyer leaned over and said something in her ear. Diana didn't move. Beverly's notarized statement was read into the record. Nate took the stand. I had watched my son do hard things before. When Patricia was sick, he drove her to every appointment for 8 months without being asked. When the diagnosis got worse, he kept showing up every day without falling apart in front of her. I'd always respected that about him. What he did on that stand was harder. He described the evening Diane had walked him through the documents, where they were sitting, which pages she'd pointed to, exactly what she'd told him each section meant. He described how she'd explained that the authorization covered utility accounts and HOA correspondence and routine property matters while I was at the clinic. He said she'd been calm and specific and that he had trusted her. His voice broke once on the word trusted. He pulled it back and finished his testimony. Sandra Holt cross-examined him for 22 minutes. She asked whether he'd read the documents independently, whether he'd consulted his own attorney, whether he'd contacted me directly to confirm before signing. Nate answered every question directly. No, he had not read them independently. No, he had not consulted anyone. No, he had not called me because his wife had told him I'd already agreed, and he had no reason at that point not to believe her. Holt tried the coercion angle for Diane. She argued that Earl had pressured his daughter, that Diane had been acting under her father's influence, that she hadn't fully understood the scope of what was being executed. Philip introduced the text messages. They had been recovered during discovery from Diane's phone. 6 weeks of messages between her and Earl beginning the day I told Nate I was flying to Rochester. Dates, figures, the name of the escrow company, discussions about Shirley Bowman and her fee. A message from Diane asking Earl how quickly they could close before I got back. Another message, sent the morning after I left for the airport, that said simply, "He's gone, move forward." Sandra Holt asked for a recess. Judge Webb denied it. The hearing concluded in the early afternoon. Judge Webb's ruling came the following week in a written order that was 9 pages long. She found sufficient cause for the civil claims of fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to proceed to trial. She issued a preliminary injunction freezing Diane and Earl's accessible assets pending resolution. She also referred the matter to the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office for criminal review. Earl's suspension became a permanent license revocation 3 weeks later. The IRS assessment came in the month after that. Back taxes on the $145,000 gain, plus penalties and interest, assessed personally, not through the LLC. The civil judgment, when it came, required Earl to compensate Lester and Nadine Calloway for the full difference between what they'd paid and a fair arm's-length market price, plus damages. The Calloways had done nothing wrong. They'd saved for 20 years for that house. The judgment made them whole, and I made a point of calling Lester personally when it came through. He thanked me and said they'd found a place in Sedona they liked even better. Diane's criminal plea came 6 weeks after the DA's review, 2 years probation. Mandatory financial fraud counseling, restitution to me, in the amount of $287,000 payable over 18 years. She walked out of that courthouse in clothes I didn't recognize, carrying a bag I'd never seen. Everything from the life she'd been living before was already gone. The family court proceedings took another 5 months. Diane's attorney argued for joint custody. She submitted character references, a letter from her employer, documentation of her involvement in Cooper's school activities. It was a reasonable presentation on paper. The problem was the evidence that came in on the other side. Philip connected Nate with a family law attorney named Gloria Weston, who had 24 years of experience in Maricopa County courts. She was thorough, and she was patient, and she understood exactly what the financial fraud case meant in the context of custody. A parent who had used a child as leverage to control the other parent's access to a grandparent. A parent who had restricted a 7-year-old's relationship with his grandfather not out of concern for the child, but as a pressure tactic during an ongoing fraud. The guardian ad litem appointed by the court interviewed Cooper twice. She also interviewed Nate, interviewed me, reviewed the text message record that had been entered in the civil case, and submitted her recommendation to the judge 3 weeks before the final hearing. I was not present for the custody hearing. That was Nate's day, not mine. He called me afterward from the parking lot, and I could hear in the first 2 words that it had gone the right way. Primary custody to Nate. Supervised visitation for Diane on alternating weekends. The judge's written findings noted a documented pattern of using the child's access to family members as an instrument of control. Nate said it twice just to hear it out loud. Then he said he was going to go pick up Cooper from Beverly's and take him for ice cream. I told him to get the big ones. The house came back to me in August. The Callaways had been fully compensated through the civil judgment and the title insurance resolution, and they vacated with no dispute. Lester and Nadine had found a place in Sedona that they said fit them better anyway. I called Lester the week before the transfer and thanked him for handling a bad situation with more grace than most people would have managed. He said he just wanted it over and wished me well. I drove to Crestview Drive on a Thursday morning with my own key, the spare I'd kept in a lockbox at Philip's office for 14 years. It worked on the first try. The house smelled different. New paint, somebody else's cleaning products, the particular neutral scent of a place that had been staged and shown and lived in briefly by strangers. The walls in the hallway were a color I hadn't chosen. The kitchen had a new backsplash. Small things that added up to a house that had been someone else's for a few months. I walked through every room, then I walked out to the garage. It was untouched. Earl had apparently gone through it during the listing period, according to the sale records. He'd categorized the contents as personal property not included in the transaction, which was correct, and left everything where it was. What he hadn't understood was that the garage wasn't just storage. Whitfield Workshop LLC had been a registered small business entity since 2014. The tools, the fabrication equipment, the workbench setups, the registered trade designs filed with the state. None of it was part of the property deed. It existed separately, under its own registration, protected by its own documentation. Earl had sold the land and the walls. He had never touched what was inside. The total assessed value of the workshop assets was $180,000. The IP registrations alone were worth more than he'd pocketed on the transaction margin. Dorothy Hale from next door came over that afternoon with a casserole and a look on her face that said she'd been waiting to do that for months. She stood on the porch and said she was glad I was home and that the neighborhood had not been the same. I thanked her and meant it. The first Saturday after I moved back in, Nate brought Cooper over at 9 in the morning. Cooper walked straight to the garage without asking. He found the level I'd taped his name to, the blue strip of masking tape with Cooper written in black marker, still on the handle where I'd put it 2 years ago. He held it up. Is this still mine? I told him it had always been his. Nate leaned in the garage doorway watching us. He looked the way people look when something that was broken for a long time is finally just fixed. Not excited, not dramatic, just settled. I told him that the workshop was his eventually, his and Cooper's. Whenever the time was right, he nodded and didn't say much. Some things don't need a lot of words. I still think about why Diane did it. I've had enough quiet evenings to go over it. She saw a 64-year-old man with a heart condition getting on a plane, and she saw a window. That's the plane version, and I think it's the right one. She didn't see the 22-year legal relationship, or the forensic examiner, or the recordings, or a son who would eventually choose his father over her. She saw an old man, and she thought that was enough. People make that mistake. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are a lot of men out there who have built something over a lifetime and assume the people closest to them will protect it. Sometimes they will, and sometimes you need to know what's in your garage. Leave a comment, pass it along. It matters more than you think.